Assalamu alaikum everybody. This is Peace Multilateralism in the UN DVST 921, and today we're going to be going over the lecture for week 12. The topic is basically a continuation of what we've been discussing since the last week, which is UN peacekeeping. And today we'll be looking at some finer details of UN peacekeeping. This is going to be a relatively shorter lecture, but I think the discussion session we have planned for Wednesday might run a little bit longer. So make sure that you take notes and make sure that you take specific notes related to the questions that I highlight for the discussion session. Now one question that I think you should be thinking about, and if somebody wants to write the response paper on this, please go ahead. So given its peacekeeping role, has the UN lived up to the high expectations of its founders? You have to answer this question at two levels. First of all, has the UN lived up to the high expectations of its founders overall? And also, has the UN lived up to the high expectations of its founders, specifically given the current situation, or just specifically given the situation in the world in, let's say, the last decade? What do you think? So just to compare peacekeeping then versus peacekeeping now, the Hanimaki reading, it gives a very nice overview, or it gives a very nice comparison of UN peacekeeping then and now. So for example, between 1948, which is when the UN was in its early years, so between 1948 and 1988, the UN authorized 13 peacekeeping missions. Although the number of interstate and intrastate wars was much higher at that time, right? क्यों था? क्योंकि इस टाइम पर सिर्फ 13 peacekeeping missions establish की गई हैं, even though this was a time जब decolonialism हो रहा था, decolonization की wave जा रही थी. And then also generally the number of interstate and intrastate wars, it was much higher, right? So we have discussed the Cold War background and why the Cold War meant that, proxy level पर भी there were a lot of decisions being taken, and then also UN Security Council के अंदर भी veto काफ़ी different ends के लिए use किया जा रहा था, and that might explain why there were so few peacekeeping missions, even though the need was there. But even after the Cold War, UN peacekeeping, it has been faced with numerous problems, and these problems, they have shattered the image of the general image जो एक UN की बनी हुई है of a benevolent organization which is neutral, that the UN as a world body is supposed to project, right? So the image or the reputation, it has suffered over the years, largely due to UN inaction, or just like their inability to ensure that peace is maintained or peace is established in areas of friction, let's say. Examples can be Rwanda, where obviously उनकी delayed reaction एक तरह से था, and then also the former Yugoslavia, जिसके अंदर Bosnia वाला सारा situation है. So we'll watch a quick video explaining why the UN failed in that particular context.
I think the most obvious answer to that is that a promise was made to protect people, particularly in the so-called safe areas, and ultimately we failed, the international community, the United Nations failed to do so with catastrophic consequences. Notwithstanding that the UN for 3 odd years had relieved humanitarian suffering, had tried to bring the parties together, and had sought to contain the conflict. the ultimate test was really whether or not protection had been provided to the population as promised. And I think that's why failure is the right word to describe the end result of the UN peacekeeping operation in Bosnia. Well, it's a very good question. I think clearly a great deal of soul searching took place afterwards. A number of reports were written, including a very thoughtful one by the Secretariat itself into the collapse of the safe areas. And from the late 1990s onwards, when UN peacekeeping began to pick up again, it became absolutely standard for every operation to have as part of its mandate the protection of civilians if they are facing imminent danger. The real question, though, is whether the lessons have been properly internalized. And I'm afraid that the answer is that we have made much the same mistake in terms of there being a big mismatch between willing the ends and willing the means. And I think this is very evident in places such as the Democratic Republic of Congo, where the UN now has a very large operation which has struggled with trying to protect civilians without adequate mandate, without adequate resources, very much reminiscent of the kind of challenges that it was facing in internal conflict in the former Yugoslavia. So it's a classic dilemma the international community is facing. It's easy to say that we will do something, we will protect civilians. The question is whether the means to do that are provided or not.
Right. So that was a quick evaluation, just a quick commentary on the Bosnia case and on UN's role in that particular context. But what was most interesting was that this person from LSE, this academic from LSE, he seems to be arguing that the lessons were learned, but they were not incorporated into future interventions, right? So lesson learning is one area where UN peacekeeping missions have lagged. So not integrated into future UN interventions or future UN peacekeeping missions. And then also Hanimaki argues that peacekeeping is no longer just about standing between two hostile sides. Right? So it's not just something that's going to be a mediator between two parties to a conflict in order to pacify a war and allow diplomacy to take its course. Peacekeeping activities today, they're far more complex in nature. Keeping peace is not the same thing as building peace. So this is very interesting. Do you agree that keeping peace is not the same thing as building peace? I mean, it makes sense, right? So building peace is a whole other project that the UN also undertakes. But then ensuring that the peace remains there and ensuring that the peace remains sustainable is a different thing. And that's essentially what peacekeeping ought to be able to do and to be able to do really well. And then going further, together with the efforts or the lack thereof in Somalia and Rwanda, Bosnia also served to discredit those who had placed high hopes in the UN peacekeeping in the post-Cold War era. Right, so again, like as another not so successful story or another failure story, Bosnia too, it sort of had reputational impacts on the UN and on the UN's capability and the UN's peacekeeping capabilities in the post-Cold War era. In the post-Cold War era, sorry. And then we're going to have a quick look at Operation Desert Storm. So we're going to go over the Persian Gulf War, really quick, and we're going to evaluate, just to do a little comparison of this with the UN's capacity for peacekeeping.
Young people in large numbers.
Right, so that was like a quick overview of the Persian Gulf War, and also how those events relate to the eventual US invasion of Iraq and the execution of Saddam Hussein. Now, the Gulf War may well have been a successful implementation of a UN Security Council resolution, but because making Iraqi forces retreat from Kuwait was possible only through the use of large-scale military force, like at least at that point in time, it seemed that this was the only option. The Gulf War was more a demonstration of American military might as the lone superpower. Again, Iskander, George H.W. Bush came out as the leader who was sort of declaring things here and there. So the Gulf War became more of a US demonstration of military might than an indication of the UN's new robust role in safeguarding international peace and security, right? So again, although the UN did have some role to play in it, but essentially this was an instance where American military might took center stage. We have another video to look at. I'll just quickly put this on. Yes, this is a much longer BBC documentary about the Gulf War. This is 1 hour long, so I'm not going to play the entire thing right now, but I have added it to the PowerPoint. To the notes section, so make sure that you have a look at it in your own time. It's very interesting, and I'm sure that you will pick out on a lot of points in that documentary. Now, how expensive or just how much did the Gulf War cost? Well, the number was $71 billion, which is huge. Compare that with the UN peacekeeping budget in 2015, right? So remember that we're talking about $71 billion in the 1990s. In 2015, the UN peacekeeping budget was about $7 billion overall, $7 billion altogether. Think about the difference between the two numbers, right? And then the point about a display of US military might becomes much more clear. Now, the peacekeeping budget, just for perspective, it's only 1% of the French defense spending, and it's only 0.1% of US defense funding. This may be one reason why peacekeeping it did not really become such a great success story as it was envisioned, right? Specifically in the 1990s and specifically in that time period until the 90s. And even after that, in some cases. In 2005, the Peacebuilding Commission was established, and it had 31 representatives, including the P5. अब इसका मकसद वगैरह क्या था? We'll just quickly look at that. Essentially, इसका role जो था वो mainly advisory ही था. So it's not like they had much power in terms of action that they could take. So it was just about what advice could they use for emerging situations. So this is just like a quick website in a way of the Peacebuilding Commission. इनका mandate क्या है? To bring together all relevant actors to marshal resources and to advise, basically advise, so emphasis on advice on and propose integrated strategies for post-conflict peace building and recovery, reconstruction, institution building efforts, and to provide recommendations. Again, it's all about having more of an advisory role as opposed to a more active role where they can take action, where they can make decisions about, let's say, the characteristics of peace building, or just like the extent of peace building that they want to go ahead with. Again, it's got 31 representatives. Usme se 5 include 5 are the permanent, 5 from the Security Council, which means that essentially there are 26 representatives. And this has been established since 2005. In the night reading, Schechter argues that preventive diplomacy was only relevant for the Cold War era, and that it needs to be replaced with a more diplomatic role for the UN in the current era, in the contemporary era. Now this was again like almost 20 years ago. So things may have changed since then, but the main argument here is that preventive diplomacy was something that was only relevant up until, let's say, the early 90s, when the Cold War era dictated a lot of decisions that were being taken by the UN, right? And the idea was that you wanted to prevent these sparks from becoming large-scale fires, essentially. Basically, उसमें UN की intervention का main reason, जैसे one of the main reasons for UN intervention would be to figure out कि कौन-कौन से areas के अंदर potential थी for conflict to become large-scale, or for conflict to get out of hand, and for even conflict to become something that attaches itself to one of the two predominant ideologies in that era. Now, since we're no longer in the Cold War era, Schechter is arguing that we need to have a more diplomatic role for the UN. Now, it's not really fleshed out as well as I would have liked. Like, what does this diplomatic role for the UN entail? So, I'll add a question mark over here. But do you agree with this idea or not? And why? Now, the diplomatic roles in the defined case, success depends on a comprehensive early warning system and further evolution of systemic changes. So, दो चीज़ें इसमें से, although ये इतना clear नहीं है, but two things they do stand out. First is early warning system, establishing an early warning system within the UN, and then the other is just like helping the evolution of systemic changes. So basically at the structural level, at the institutional level, थोड़ी सी changes चाहिए so that a diplomatic role for the UN can be ensured. Now, one criticism of preventive diplomacy is that it has clouded consideration of which position or UN body is responsible for conducting the diplomacy. We did see examples of this in the Congo case, जिसमें there was a lot of blurriness, right, in terms of who was in charge in some cases. And so that's like one major criticism that Schechter poses about preventive diplomacy. Essentially, what position or even what UN body is supposed to be responsible for conducting the diplomacy. Is it supposed to be the Secretary General's representative in that area? Is it supposed to be the military forces, or who is exactly responsible there? And that's a problem when key decisions need to be made, and also a problem when you need an authoritative figure on ground to be able to sort of run the show, essentially. So what else can the diplomacy for the UN in the postmodern era entail? The nature of security threats, as we've discussed last week, again is different now compared with the Cold War era. Now we have very different risks जिनको हमने handle करना है, जिनको UN essentially handle करना, right? So you've got terrorism, you've got things that you've got essentially wars that are not necessarily fought on the battlefield, right? So you've got different threats essentially now. The institutional capacity required now, according to the Schechter reading, is beyond that of the Secretary General's office and the Security Council and enhanced information gathering, right? So it's not just the institutional capacity of the UN as it stands now is not enough, essentially, is what is being argued here, that it needs to evolve. But then we know from our discussions that evolving or just changing institutions is not a very easy thing. It's not like a switch that you can just turn on or off. it's something that requires radical shift, it requires radical transformation, and institutions by their nature are sticky and they're very, very not amenable to change. So how do you achieve this? Do you agree with this idea that institutional capacity required now is beyond that of the Secretary General's office? Like, we need maybe a larger figurehead, or we need just reimagine the UN. Do you agree with that idea? And even for early warning systems, if you want to develop early warning systems, I think the UN has evolved towards developing early warning systems. Basically, when we say, okay, आजकल we are living in an age of information, and we are living in a data age, right? So the UN is slowly gearing itself, I think, for using data for these different things, or just using data and AI for whatever purposes, for whatever functions it has traditionally been set up for, right? So in that sense, it is evolving. It's evolving in the means that it uses, but institutionally it's still pretty much the same. So what is required when we talk about UN diplomacy? In addition to supplementary resources, for example, again, better early warning system, better global monitoring systems, so that the UN, including the Secretary General, but also the specialized and related agencies and UNDP and all those things, in even regional institutions and even international NGOs, right? So they have to be capable of being proactive rather than reactive in the face of security crisis. We've discussed the idea of being proactive rather than reactive in the previous discussion session as well, and in the previous lecture as well. So I'm not going to go into too much detail about that, but I will highlight the early warning and global monitoring system, right? So what specifically the global monitoring system, what problems can you foresee? Are all countries going to be okay with being monitored? I don't guess so. So there will be a lot of issues that emerge with regards to state sovereignty being disrespected in a way. But then again, in order to ensure that the UN is able to perform its preventive, not just preventive, it's able to perform its peacekeeping roles, are these two things necessary? Are these two things necessary specifically given the current security situation of the world? What do you think? I need to put a star here so we can make a note of this. So the main difference, essentially, the idea that we get from this passage is that the main difference is of being proactive. That's basically the direction where the UN essentially should be headed. What are the challenges for UN diplomacy? If we talk about early warning systems, जो कि हमें proactive UN को proactive होने के लिए help करेंगे, we need to decide to whom these early warnings are given. Are these early warnings going to be given to specific bodies within the UN Security Council? Is it going to get to the UN Secretary General's office, or are they going to be given even to the parties to a potential conflict? With information gathering, one other question arises: is the UN so embedded in the state-centric system that it cannot provide information from subnational and non-state actors? Right? Because especially if you consider terrorism, it is mostly conducted by non-state actors, right? So if we assume that the UN is still embedded in a state-centric system, that it's not truly international as an organization, how will it rely, or how will it provide information from subnational non-state actors? Because there is a likelihood of states withholding information. So how is it going to surpass that barrier, basically? Another question is lack of information on the problem, or the misinterpretation of information, a bigger problem, right? What do you think? Is misinformation worse, or is a lack of information worse, specifically given the current age of, fake news? Which of these two would you say is a bigger challenge? Now finally, UN diplomacy, it will be limited by the state system in which the UN is embedded. Again, the degree to which the pillars of state sovereignty remain in place and to which ideological heterogeneity persists or expands. Right, so basically, the UN diplomacy, if you want to evaluate whether or not UN diplomacy is going to be successful, you also have to contextualize it. कि वो कौन से state system के अंदर embedded है, right? The degree to which the pillars of state sovereignty remain in place wherever it is that the UN diplomacy is targeted, and also what ideological underpinnings exist in that particular area. So these three conditions sort of inform the degree to which UN diplomacy is going to be successful or not. एक सक्सेस हमारे पास स्टोरी आ जाती है मैसेडोनिया की ऑफ प्रिवेंटिव डिप्लोमेसी. You just have a quick view of what happened there. This was between 1992 and 1998. Again, this is the 90s.
In December 1992, the United Nations Security Council voted to immediately send a UN protection force to the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. The decision came just 3 months after a request from the Macedonian President Kiro Gligorov to the UN Secretary General, who agreed that it was of utmost importance to prevent war in former Yugoslavia from spreading to this small and vulnerable republic in the south. It was the first time ever that the UN has sent peacekeeping troops to a region before war has broken out. What is the UN's role in the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia almost 2 years into its mission? A question we put to Hugo Anson, delegate to the Special Representative of the UN Secretary General.
Until now, the United Nations here has done a very good job on the military front by monitoring the border, the northern border here, and also the northwestern border. With the 1,100 troops roughly that we have here. The challenge now is to see how we can help this country more on the political and economic fronts. It's very difficult for this country to survive at the moment.
29 observation posts have now been set up along the Albanian and Serbian borders. The UN has a 570-man battalion from Finland, Norway and Sweden, known as Nordbat, and some 540 US soldiers which form USBAT. Their preventative mandate is to monitor and report any developments in the border area which could undermine confidence and stability in the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia or threaten its territory. It's a round-the-clock job being conducted with sophisticated observation, communications and transportation equipment. This is one of the 3 new Sikorsky Black Hawk helicopters, known in the UN as White Hawks, which the US battalion recently deployed. Lieutenant Colonel John Baggett is the USBAT commander.
This one right up here is a border crossing, and they have good visibility to watch the border, and this is the only trail that goes into it. The one over here, 5-5, which is directly behind you to my front, has a good overwatch of the entire sector. The cooperation with the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia has been magnificent. And I will also tell you that the cooperation from the Serbian forces have also been good.
The capital city of Skopje. In this ethnically diverse republic, it's not only the ethnic Macedonians, but also the minorities, Albanians, Turks, Gypsies and Vlachs, who welcome the UN's peacekeeping presence. President Kiro Gligorov gives his assessment.
Разбира се дека тоа не значи војна заштита на Македонија 1000 души, но значи многу за да се свати од евентуално од било кој агресор или оној кој би сакал да предизвика некои конфликти во Македонија, дека за се ќе биде на време известено и ќе се знае точно што се случува, кој е агресор, кој е предизвикувач на конфликти, за да може меѓународната заедница да реагира на време. Друго, тоа е за прв пат, како што знаете, да американците учествуваат во мировни сили под команда која не е америчка. Нивното присуство е добро заради тоа што е тоа сигнал дека и Соединетите американски држави, не само преку Обединетите нации, се заинтересирани за сочување на мирот и стабилноста на овој дел на Балкан.
One of the UN's priorities is to help resolve border tensions. This is of particular importance when there is no universal agreement on precisely where the border lies. In one such case, in mid-June this year, the Yugoslav army set up an observation post on Trupino Brdo, known in the UN as Hill 1703, which both Belgrade and Skopje claim is on their territory. In advance of a planned border commission which the UN hopes will ultimately resolve the dispute, these UN monitors trekked up and down Hill 1703, at times in pouring rain, to liaise between the Serbian and Macedonian armies who have been facing each other at less than a kilometer's distance for several weeks. As a result of the UN's mediation over Hill 1703, a new temporary observation post and a 1,000-meter buffer zone were established along what the UN calls its Northern Line area of operations. Brigadier General Telefson, the regional commander of UN forces, negotiated the deal on July 10, 1994.
I had 3 meetings with the Serbian General Staff, and I've just returned from a meeting in Belgrade Saturday, and my idea was to discuss the possibility to reduce the tension in the border area. They have moved one OP now back some 100 meters, and that is a very positive step from the Serbian side.
Defense Minister Vlado Popovski summarizes.
Со UNPROFOR и кооперацијата со него сме многу задоволни. UNPROFOR фактички придонесе за стабилизација на Република Македонија, ги намали тензиите околу границите на Република Македонија и овозможи таа да се конституира во мирен процес и да ги изведе сите стандардни процедури за избори на институциите на власт.
But an unloaded job is never done. Here in the village of Malina Malo on the Serbian border, the Nordic Battalion operates 2 observation posts near an area frequently patrolled by soldiers of the Yugoslav army. This is a source of concern to the local villagers. In order to reduce tension on all sides, Nordbat held discussions with both the villagers and the Serb soldiers. They visit the local mayor, who's been given a direct hotline to keep the nearby observation post informed of developments.
The main aim with this kind of patrolling is to show both the Macedonian people here in the villages and the Serbian soldiers on the other side of the border that we are actually here. We have had very good relationships with all the villages here in this area, very much because of the behavior from our soldiers within the battalion. And the people, they trust in the UN soldiers. They believe that they need UN presence here.
So how long will the UN stay, and how will it respond to the rapid change of events within the wider Balkan region?
Ние уште и кога баравме да дојдат тука, баравме со таква цел да бидат со наблюдувачка мисија. Она досега ги задоволи потребите. Разбира се, доколку би се појавиле некои нови моменти кои упозоруваат на некои нови големи опасности и друго, тогаш, разбира се, би разговарале и за промена на мандат.
The world community has sent the signal to Macedonia, telling them that they will try now to support this young nation to become a new democratic nation in the Balkans. It's very important that we stay for some years. I'm speaking about 5-10 years, not 5 or 10 weeks or months. This commitment has to be something that the Macedonian authorities should rely on.
In mid-July this year, US Defense Secretary William Perry visited Skopje and said, Macedonia plays a crucial role and is in many ways the key to stability in the entire Balkan region. The statement underlined the United Nations view that the kind of preventative peacekeeping it is practicing in the region could set an example for missions in other potential trouble spots throughout the world.
Right, so that was a very comprehensive look at what UN peacekeeping preventive deployment in Macedonia achieved. Now, the key thing about preventive deployment here and its success was essentially in the signaling that it did, right? So signaling comes off as a very key thing. Signaling to the world community that the UN is looking at, that the UN is, aware of potential issues that may arise, and then also signaling to would-be enemies or would-be adjutants on the Macedonian border that even though the UN force only numbered around 1,000 military personnel, but still that they were monitoring the situation, and that if need be, they would call for backup, and that they would ensure that that such conflict did not really arise and did not really become a larger scale conflict, right? So the signaling, to a very large extent, decides whether or not preventive deployment or preventive diplomacy in deployment of UN military forces, of UN peacekeeping forces, can or cannot be successful. But it is very important to remember that correlation, it does not mean causation. Just हमने last week ही discuss किया था, right? So it is impossible to prove कि ये UN का जो mission था, which was called UNPDEP, had a deterrent effect, right? क्योंकि हमें ये नहीं, because things happened in a certain way, it's difficult for us to tell कि अगर वो उस तरह ना होती तो फिर क्या impact होता या क्या conflict होता भी या ना होता. And it also takes us back to the idea that there must be peace to keep for peacekeeping to work, right? उसने आपने वीडियो में भी देखा होगा कि relations were very cordial, right? Even with that local mayor and with different parties, right? So it's not कि वो cordiality, right? So there was peace to keep. The parties, they wanted peace, and therefore it was easy for the UN peacekeeping force to do its job. And also the UN Good Office's function was in display there. It also encouraged the peaceful solution to inter-ethnic problems as well, as mentioned in Right to the. There was also no humanitarian component in the UN PREDEP mandate, but still some officials did feel that iski need hai, right? So to alleviate certain humanitarian needs, क्योंकि इस preventive deployment का main function क्या था कि कोई conflict ना arise. So they did not really have any humanitarian mandate at the initial levels. But then when officials felt that there should be some funds available to alleviate certain humanitarian needs, the challenges then became funding and also personnel, right? And also whose domain this was going to be. Was it going to be the domain of the existing forces that were present, or would additional forces or would additional personnel be required? So again, there were a lot of logistical challenges towards delivering that humanitarian aid. And then also think about exit strategies, right? So एक चीज़ होती है कि डिसाइड करना कि किस पॉइंट के ऊपर डिप्लॉयमेंट ज़रूरी है to prevent conflict from arising, and then the other difficult thing to decide is when is a good time for the UN deployment of forces to end. When is a good time to say कि ठीक है, the deployment or the preventive diplomacy, it has worked, and that the UN forces can withdraw. It is a critical thing, right? So what if some peacekeeping forces, they exit too early, too prematurely? That would mean कि conflict फिर भी arise हो सकता है. So how do you know कि सही time अब है? So it is a critical thing, as I said. And another interesting thing is कि किस तरह से मैसेडोनिया वाला जो सारा deployment था वो ख़त्म कैसे हुआ. So 1999 February में China vetoed the renewal of UN PREDEP's mandate, and this happened right after the newly elected Macedonian government. It established diplomatic relations with Taiwan, which obviously China was not going to be okay with, and so China broke diplomatic relations with Macedonia, right? So what does this show? Even this was like long after the Cold War ended, but still it showed that peacekeeping operations of the UN, they cannot be divorced from the foreign policies of key members of the Security Council. Just as UN peacekeeping operations during the Cold War era could not be separated from the foreign policies of key members of the Security Council, i.e. That is the US and Russia. So to say कि Cold War era के बाद से इस तरह के foreign policies did not really dictate Security Council's key decisions is not really all true, right? क्योंकि उसके बाद भी foreign policies, they still trump international good एक तरह से, or the overall good, or just the general internationally recognized important thing in a way. So again, state sovereignty, it still takes an upper position in set of priorities that a member of a Security Council would accord to a certain situation. So this was all for today.